When I was a kid, my mother would take my sisters and I for camping holidays in the height of summer. Of the recurring destinations, Malakuta was a particular favourite. On the edge of Croajingolong National Park, at the mouth of this series of beautiful inlets, it's on the far north coast of Victoria. And it's one of those places where, while the year-round population is only about 1,000, in summer, when the camping ground is full, that number is more like 8,000. I remember those long, glorious days splashing around on Betka Beach or sitting in the basketball hall watching the makeshift cinema. But of those entertainments, the absolute pinnacle was the farmers' market each weekend, not least because it was a reliable source of second-hand books. It was there one summer, having exhausted the reading I'd packed for the holiday, that I picked up my first Bruce Pascoe novel. In hindsight, it's clear to me that the quiet bloke with the big beard who sold it to me was the author himself. This wasn't a second-hand stall, this was someone who loved to write, making a connection with potential readers, in between the Dreamcatcher stall and the homemade chutneys. That more than 2 decades later Bruce Pascoe would be a household name was unthinkable at the time. That he would still be writing, still honouring his commitment to telling a great story, that is utterly unsurprising. I'm Michael Williams, and this is Read This, the show about the books we love and the stories behind them. It was 2014 when Bruce Pascoe went from being a prolific yet relatively unknown writer to public enemy number one in Australia's culture wars. That was the year he published his now infamous book Dark Emu and its re-examination of accepted historical accounts of pre-invasion Australia. It's a book that struck a chord. More than 360,000 copies have been sold so far, and it's inspired various spin-off books, from a young adult edition to entire books published to refute its claims about First Nations people and their relationship with the land. News Corp in particular have expended a lot of energy framing Bruce as this ahistorical force of propaganda. It's nasty, ugly stuff. But part of what I like about Bruce Pascoe is his calm, implacable generosity. He's engaged critics and detractors and welcomed the debate. For all the attempts to co-opt him into the culture wars, Bruce is not so interested. He has other stories to tell. And the latest one is his novel Imperial Harvest. It's set in 13th century Mongolia, and it follows a one-armed soldier, Yen Si, as he contemplates the expectations of others and how a single person can navigate war and colonialism with grace and endurance. And it begins with a disclaimer, this author's warning, that sums up how Bruce Pascoe approaches the world.
This novel tells a story of great armies, the calumny of powerful men travelling across the vast lands of Eurasia. But if there's a date here or a town there which seems strange, remember that history tosses all fact in the air, so the victor can choose his own confetti. In this case, the confetti is chosen by the losers, so be patient. It's not always possible to catch the pieces in their original order, and in any case, it will be confetti again tomorrow. Don't be dismayed by this fact. You're alive, aren't you?
I love the idea of it returning to confetti, and also telling your readers not to be dismayed. I mean, often, particularly with historical fiction, we have this anxiety of not just what's true and what's not, but what's a legitimate speaking position from which to tell history and what's not. And setting that note at the front of the novel seems to be saying, it's a book. It's here for you to have fun, see what it sparks. There is a lot of implied goodwill in that request of your readers.
And because of that, it ends in a restaurant where people enjoy wine, they enjoy food, and they enjoy sharing it. And they are slightly alarmed by their company. It was meant to be a kind gesture of asking people not to hate, but to come together a little bit. And, you know, it's easy for people to polarise their situation and to take positions. But I'll never forget being told by a very old Hawaiian woman that when you're having these arguments, leave no one behind. In my own town of Malakuta, there are debates which have ended up being polarised when a perfectly good compromise situation was available. You know, compromise is messy, muddy, unsatisfying to most people, but they're usually more right than wrong. And we need to treasure the messiness of democracy, because the cleanliness of autocracy is to be abhorred. And we've seen no good example in the world of autocracies where marginal groups weren't flayed. So I hope we can sit down in a restaurant together, the restaurant being the world, and keep talking.
When people think Bruce Pascoe, they don't generally think 13th century Mongolia. So what's that about?
Yeah, I know everyone was expecting a certain kind of novel, and it did come as a bit of a surprise to a lot of people, but the whole idea of the novel is to look at the propensity of men to commit violence. Where does it come from? And I didn't want to just concentrate on the Europeans, because people are expecting me to be critical of European colonialism, but there are other examples of colonialism, and Genghis Khan is as good as any.
Oh, it's one of the biggies. I mean, that's a decent one to go for, to lean into.
Well, to cover an entire continent is pretty ambitious.
Before we get to Khan, temperamentally, is that typical of you, Bruce? Like, you know what people expect from you, and so you're determined not to give it to them?
Well, it wasn't a determination. This novel I've been writing for 15 years, so it began before Dark Emu.
Yeah.
So I'm not a curmudgeon in that sense. I am a curmudgeon in many senses, but not that particular one. It's just the way my thoughts have been going, and they're a little bit out of sync, but to me it doesn't matter. I'm just looking forward to talking about the book, and for readers to wonder about the book, and then let's have a conversation about it, because the conversation is very timely.
The conversation is incredibly timely, and sadly it always will be. Like a conversation about the nature of war, about the ways in which it impacts a life, a psyche, a people more generally. You're always going to be blessed with that feeling topical.
Yeah. Look, when I went to school, I was taught that war is the natural condition of man. And I thought at the time, what a bleak prospect for the world. What a bleak prospect for people, individuals, that we have to do that. I remember in primary school listening to the last post on Anzac Day and being so deeply affected by it, because, you know, our family had lost people in both wars, and they were very emotional services. And I thought, gee, we're just going to keep doing this forever. There'll be a new Anzac Day and it'll just repeat ad infinitum. And I thought how sad that was. But I didn't have the resources as a kid to look at whether or not that is the truth. And I've been very fortunate to have met and lived with people who have another experience of the world, the Aboriginal cultural world, and our families are connected to that story, and it's a story without war. So what I'm really hopeful for is that Australia can have this conversation, that is war the natural condition of man? Is there another way for humans to behave towards each other? And I think there is. I think that's a fabulous philosophical challenge for this country, to think that it might have on this continent a solution to what's happening in Palestine at the moment.
I love that idea, and it's a kind of stirring and wonderful thought, but I can't help but feel that colonial Australia, settler Australia, does what so many countries do, in its national myth building, which is it appears to believe that war is essential for your sense of yourself. We fetishize that experience of war rather than look for a way to never reproduce it.
Yeah, we see it as essential to ourselves, and that, if an argument gets to a certain point, then eventually you will go to arms, and that's a legitimate political and philosophical stance to take. So to consider something else is going to take maybe 230 years, and I obviously won't be around, but I'm determined to contribute to that debate. And for Australia to consider that their idea of Australian history might need some refinement, or that what Aboriginal Australian people were doing was not hunting and gathering, we can see by the turmoil that has erupted subsequent to that discussion taking place, that it's really hard to change people's minds, and that they won't change them peacefully.
Well, I do think there is something in what you had to endure in response to Dark Emu that is a real precursor to the way the voice referendum took place, which is that there was a request, an offering of a space for a conversation. Mm. And instead of responding to that in good faith and taking it as a conversation, recognising that there might be ground to be met in the middle, there might be disagreement, there might be whatever, but the conversation itself is valuable, instead of responding in that way, the response was vitriolic and violent and about tearing down rather than about being willing to take the chat further.
Yeah, I think there is a great parallel there, but I believe strongly that, say, in 150 years, when kids at university are sitting down to do their essays, that they will be looking at the events of last year, and the no vote will be a footnote. But I think Australia has an enormous and positive opportunity to lead the world intellectually on this point. Not always, it's not a league ladder and you don't remain champion forever. But in this particular little moment of time, I think Australia can make a really decent contribution to world conversation about how we behave as humans. And what I love about the old people and all the so-called myths or stories, it's really philosophy that we're talking about. And that philosophy is one of enormous peace about the kind of structures you put in place to control humans, because the human is a really difficult animal. The human will always be jealous, always be violent, always be loving, always be honourable, all that mix that is in all of us. The human's always going to be like that. But to consider how best to use each of those, suppress some and enhance others, I think it's an enormous thing. I just think it's a great thing for humans to consider and for us to discuss. It's not a blueprint that will be built tomorrow. It's up for discussion.
It's one of the things I so enjoy about your intellectual and cultural contribution generally, Bruce, is the optimism I don't understand. I'm sorry. I'm glad you hold it, and I wish I shared it, and that is great. But the generosity of inviting the conversation, inviting the chat, responding to your critics by saying, absolutely, let's talk about it. That's not it. Like, there are very few people in public life I can think of who have more grace when it comes to believing in the value of what you're doing beyond whether people agree with you or don't agree with you.
You can blame my mother and grandmother for that, because they insisted on decency. And I haven't been able to escape that tug in my brain. But also, I think I'm in a good position to be in the argument because, obviously over 80% of our family is white. and a small percentage is Aboriginal. So I've got an obligation to both sides, and I've got a huge obligation to white Australia because that's where most of our genes come from. I have an obligation to that side of the family to say, look, I'm not ignoring the Cornishman, I'm not ignoring the Englishman, but there's this other thing, and it's Australian. This is where we can have an effect on the history of the country.
When we return, Bruce reveals why seaside towns are places of descent. We'll be right back. I remember reading one of your novels many, many years ago and being so moved by the way you wrote, being so kind of carried along by the story. But also, you write books clearly from a place of having an idea about the world that you want to share, you want to prosecute, you want to imagine.
Yeah, and I was talking to Melissa Lukashenko and Deborah Dank yesterday morning about Charles Dickens. This is a good conversation, good literary conversation, because we'd all read Dickens and we'd all felt touched by his compassion. But I've just read Priya Satia, Time's Monster, where she talks about Dickens's fascism as well. And that was incredibly disappointing. But he's a human.
Yep.
He's a flawed human. We're all flawed humans, and it was just a fascinating conversation, and it's very relevant when we're having these conversations. It's never black and white. The shades of grey, another literary reference, are immense, and we have to accommodate that. We have to continue to have the conversation rather than saying you're too white or you're too black, you're so grey. And just keep talking. And democracy is the slowest beast on earth, but it's a very, very good beast to have in our paddock.
So accepting that you knew you wanted to write about the nature and the legacy of war and colonialism, you knew you wanted to begin that story, that journey in the Northern Hemisphere, and you knew that actually European colonialism wasn't the path that you wanted to look at. That kind of explains 13th century Mongolia as a choice. But tell us a little bit about a particular one-armed horseman called Yen-Si and why he was the vessel for the story that you wanted to tell.
Well, I really wanted to choose someone who history would ignore. He wasn't a general. He wasn't even a particularly brave soldier. He was nothing. He was on the scrap heap of humanity. But he had the good fortune to fall into the company of a really good man who was also never going to be noticed by history, a baker, a miller. But that miller, his life's journey had taught him, because of the pain he had endured, that people need care. So in a way, it's Penkai who is the driver of the story. Yen-Si is just swept up in the stream and becomes more worldly and becomes more aware of his position as a human and finds himself in a position to make change. So I wanted an anonymous person. When I began writing Imperial Harvest, I was very anonymous. You know, you mentioned having read my novels. Well, I wondered who bought that book because, I've written 7 or 8 novels and the sales of each was really small.
I reckon I bought it from you in person in Malakuta, beside the camping ground there when the market's set up, and I bought it from you then on a camping holiday.
Yeah, well, we sold books from that little tent for a decade or more, nearly 2 decades, and the conversations in that tent, if they ever got to the Australia Spy Agency, we'd be all in trouble because it was a ferment of rebellion.
I think the spy agencies know not to look at Malakuta, that it's a hotbed, there's dangerous stuff going on there. Yeah. They're better to turn a blind eye.
Well, one of my novels talks about seaside villages as being places of dissent because fishermen don't give a stuff about anyone.
Yeah, no, and they've got time to talk things through. It's not about action, it's about scheming.
Yeah, it is, and in Imperial Harvest there are whole groups of sailors and fishermen, and that's what they do. They because their life is on the sea, they feel themselves totally independent of the land, and they have contempt for politicians, and they're pirates. You know, the sea and piracy go together.
It's one of the very nice things about how the book functions, Imperial Harvest functions, and you kind of alluded to this before, but is because it centres around a protagonist who is, passive's the wrong word, but is kind of buffeted by war, by circumstance, by history. It means that the characters who emerge around the fringes of the story are often incredibly compelling. They're pushing it forward in really interesting ways.
Mm. Well, I'm glad you see it like that because I was afraid that my mangling of history would have become a theme because it's not an historical novel because I've shifted geographies, I've shifted historical events, but I'm more fascinated by people than I am by history, and people generate history, but it's more or less like an aside. It's the people themselves, and I think goodness and badness drive the world, and it's up to us to decide which is which.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Finally, just because I have to ask for myself, because I haven't been back for years, how's Malakuta going post the fires?
Malakuta is its wonderful self. 3 rivers, 2 lakes, the ocean. It's hard to destroy the beauty of that. The bush recovered very quickly, the people not as quickly. Friends of mine put the roof on their house a fortnight ago after losing their house in the fire. Another good friend of mine was a renter, doesn't have a house at all. The psyche of the town is different. And maybe it's my age group because I've lost a lot of friends I've known since 1970 in the last few years, and they were the real rebels and ratbags, and the people with whom, if you caught their eye in the street, they would not let you go because they'd want to talk to you about politics. They'd want to tell you how disgraceful the Australian cricket team is. All that conversation, a lot of that's gone, so the fun for me has gone out of the town. But there are young kids there making their own legends and their own society, to which I'm not a party. And I have to get used to that because I'm an old man.
We all have to get used to that one way or the other, but as long as you keep writing books, you've got that entry point straight back into that. You can be an old man on the edge, keeping an eye.
Look, writing's such a wonderful thing, I look at musicians, tugging their cello onto the aeroplane, and artists, with rolls and rolls of fine paper, and I jump on the plane with a biro.
Yeah, perfect. Bruce Pascoe, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
Bruce Pascoe's latest novel, Imperial Harvest, is out now, and you can get it at all good independent bookstores. And just to piss off Andrew Bolt, go buy another copy of Dark Emu while you're at it. Just to twist the knife. Before we go, I wanted to tell you what I've been reading this week, and we could probably give over an entire episode of Read This to talk about cover endorsements. In the book industry, they're known as puffs. It's where another writer is asked to give a recommendation for a new book that's coming out. If you love this person, then you'll love this book, that kind of thing. and there are fabulous stories about it. Some writers, I'm going to name US writer Gary Steingart, for example, are so synonymous with cover endorsements that actually it doesn't mean anything to hear from them anymore in that capacity. But when a new book lands on my desk and it has a cover endorsement from Eleanor Catton and Max Porter, when it compares the readability of that book to Tomorrow and Tomorrow and Tomorrow or Audrey Niffenegger's Time Traveller's Wife, then I kind of know it's going to be my cup of tea. The book in question is a time travel romance, a spy thriller, a workplace comedy. It's called The Ministry of Time. It's by Kellyanne Bradley, and frankly, I can't wait to get back to it. You can find these books and all the others we mentioned at your favourite independent bookstore. That's it for this week's show. As always, rate, review and share. It helps us enormously. We don't normally do TV recommendations on Read This, but I have been adoring the new HBO show The Sympathizer. You may be aware it's an adaptation of Viet Thanh Nguyen's Pulitzer Prize-winning novel of a few years ago. And next week on the show, I talk to the man himself about his new memoir and why becoming a writer made him a man of two faces.
The more I acquired English, the more I became a better reader, the more I learned about English language, literature, the Anglo-American tradition, the more I became a writer, the more I became an American, the further away I was taken from my parents. And that alienation, I think, is partly what motivates me as a writer and gives me the fuel and the motivation to be a writer, which led to some success, but it's also, ironically, the alienation that distanced me from my parents.
Read This is produced and edited by Clara Ames. Mixing and original compositions by Zoltan Fetcher. Thanks for listening. See you next week.